We'll move on to the third part of tonight. If we keep moving, it's going to be a late night anyway, so we'll keep going. This is on extensions and alterations. The first question that we have is, should we maintain the long-standing design criteria that are present in our existing policies, or are the current policies considered to be too prescriptive? And this is specifically to do with extensions and alterations, but obviously if there's other design elements, feel free to raise them.
Buildings, the interiors of streets, and if we consume if we walk down a street, we consume it in a sort of sense. It's a public good. There's very strong arguments for controlling that environment. The backs of buildings are not so visible. Their neighbours are affected, but otherwise, why is it really so important to have consent? If your building is listed in order to prune a tree in your back garden. It's absurd.
So you're saying for the less visible elements of a building, we probably are too prescriptive in your opinion?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Paul Villoway. The parallel existing policies, both in relation to conservation areas and alterations and extensions generally, do appear to be, and again, it's subject to interpretation by officers and members, unduly prescriptive, particularly, for instance, the requirement that the design should reflect the style and details of the existing building. In many cases, that might be an entirely appropriate approach, but in many others, a creative approach to design, a creative approach to conservation can generate the kind of quality buildings that I think you've illustrated in Design in Westminster and in the new booklet. So I think, again, it comes back to wording, it comes back to interpretation. There are enormous variations in this, discernible, I find, over the recent years. Those that, suggesting that in engagement with officers who are insisting on a like-for-like matching approach, and those that do recognise that in the right circumstance, contrast and new design can work very successfully indeed. So I think it's a matter of looking at those existing policy wordings, both in relation to alterations generally and in relation to historic buildings, that there would be benefit in developing, say, a more creative approach, not setting aside things that matter, but actually complementing that with the recognition that new design can assist and contribute positively.
Thank you.
John East, Savills. I'd like to endorse what Paul said. I think Westminster's policies compared to most others boroughs are probably rather more prescriptive, and indeed it's my experience that they are applied more prescriptively by your officers. And to that end, I think that does have the potential and indeed does stifle a more creative approach. And of course, you do have a tension if, going back to the topic earlier in the evening, you do want to create, or to encourage more innovative and contemporary design. So I would urge you to look at those particular policies again.
Thank you.
I'd just like to support those two comments, actually, but also just add a bit of a worry about, are we talking about building over gardens? And if so, doesn't the new mayor have at least half a policy about that?
What would be your preferred policy approach for building over gardens?
Well, it depends entirely on the area, obviously, but if it's, for example, listed buildings or a conservation area where there were gardens originally, many of the extensions will lead to overdevelopment. You get an extension of an extension upwards, an extension sideways. And many of the rooms that were beautifully airy and didn't need air conditioning end up requiring air conditioning. Also, from the point of view of the clay and 19th century foundations, you end up with more cracking, and there's problems with water runoff and so on. So, it depends very much on the area and the buildings you're talking about. But I'd like to see gardens in conservation areas retained wherever possible.
Okay. Are there any other? Yeah. Sorry.
Aldous Hodgkinson. I'd like to support what the first two gentlemen said, because I think it is so important in terms of Westminster's future, given the extent of conservation area and historic buildings that you have, that creativity in bringing older buildings up to modern standards is absolutely a central part of your policies. I actually believe they're more important in the long term than worries about tall buildings, because it's such an extensive part of the borough. And I certainly think from my own experience that the policy it simply doesn't encourage a contemporary approach to how to solve those problems.
Okay, thank you.
Gwyneth Hampson again. I'm the member for Regent's Park, and I have to say that underground extensions under gardens are the bane of my life, and even more the bane of the lives of the councillors in Abbey Ward, which is adjacent to mine. The big problem, which we don't seem to be able to solve, and I probably can't solve, is the disruption to neighbours. The neighbours go nearly hysterical over the noise of the piling and the excavation works, which are so inappropriate in a sort of tight residential area. And it would be really good if we could find some way of mitigating that particular problem. As I understand it, you can extend the basement under your house. You can go down as hundreds of metres if you want to, provided it's within the footprint. But and they are obviously a nuisance to people. But the really tiresome ones are the ones that dig up gardens, the back gardens in St John's Wood, and it would be really good if we could find a way to help my constituents. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to clarify the position on the under footprint?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right that under the revised GPDO, underground or excavation beneath the footprint of the building effectively is permitted development. It doesn't obviously, if it's a listed building, it will still require listed building consent. So in terms of planning control, we can't exercise any other than where it extends beyond what is permitted.
But is there no extra planning necessary in the village? Because clearly the planning system doesn't do it. And the people who are having the work done are not there. The people who are suffering are all the neighbours. And it seems increasingly important. Planners say that they're really more or less impotent to deal with it. It's merely under the building itself. But the problem exists. And the problem is getting worse, it seems.
I mean, outside of planning, I mean, there are obviously other pieces of legislation with respect to noise and nuisance, that environmental legislation, which potentially can control certain aspects of that. I mean, I'm not an expert on the details of that legislation, but I'm aware that where there is an impact on residential amenity which doesn't really or isn't really controlled or controllable by planning, that it can still be enforced under other legislation.
Why isn't there somebody from that area of expertise here now dealing with that?
More because this was more about what we could do about planning policy rather than those other aspects. But
Well, don't these things run together? I mean, isn't there some joined-up thinking necessary here to deal with the problem that people have in this area?
I think there certainly is, and certainly the noise strategy, for example, coming forward and those sorts of things. So we do work very closely, but I think tonight we really are here to just look at what we can do in terms of planning policy. So we haven't invited the range of officers who might be able to respond more adequately to the other